At 18 years old, Zara Williams thought her biggest worry would be choosing a college major, not becoming collateral for her father's gambling debt to a Korean crime syndicate. When $500,000 in unpaid debts forces her family into an impossible choice, she finds herself walking down an aisle toward a dangerous stranger who holds her family's fate in his hands. Zara Williams had graduated high school just 2 months ago with a 4.0 GPA and a full scholarship to Howard University. At 18, she was supposed to be picking out dorm decorations and planning her pre-med classes, dreaming of the stethoscope that would one day hang around her neck. Instead, she sat in her family's cramped living room in Southeast D.C., listening to her father explain how his gambling addiction had destroyed their lives in ways she never imagined possible. Her father, Marcus Williams, sat hunched over the coffee table, his hands shaking as he spread out papers covered in Korean characters and dollar amounts that made Zara's stomach clench. The final number at the bottom was circled in red ink. $500,000. More money than their family had ever seen, owed to people whose names she couldn't pronounce, but whose reputation for violence preceded them into every conversation. The man sitting across from them looked like he belonged in a boardroom, not their worn-down apartment with its peeling wallpaper and second-hand furniture. Kang Jin-woo was 40 years old, Korean, and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the room unconsciously lower their voices. His expensive black suit was perfectly tailored, his dark hair swept back with precision, and his sharp features gave nothing away as he studied Zara with calculating dark eyes. Marcus cleared his throat, his voice cracking as he spoke. "There's a way to settle the debt," he said, not looking at his daughter. "Mr. Kang needs a wife for business purposes. Someone young, educated, presentable. The marriage would clear everything." Zara felt the words hit her like physical blows. Marriage? To this stranger. This dangerous man who radiated controlled menace even while sitting perfectly still in their threadbare armchair. Her mother, Patricia, sat silent in the corner, tears streaming down her face, unable to meet Zara's eyes. "The scholarship," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible. "Howard University. My future." Kang Jin-woo spoke for the first time, his English perfect but accented, his tone as cold as winter steel. "Your future, Miss Williams, is whatever keeps your family breathing. My associates are not known for their patience with outstanding debts." She stared at this man who held her life in his hands like a chess piece. He was handsome in a sharp, dangerous way, but there was nothing warm in his expression, nothing that suggested he saw her as anything more than a business transaction. The age difference felt vast. 22 years separated them, 22 years of experiences she couldn't imagine. The ceremony took place 3 days later in a small courthouse in downtown D.C. Zara wore a simple white dress her mother had bought from a department store, her hands trembling as she signed papers that would bind her legally to a man whose last name she had only learned that morning. Kang Jin-woo wore another perfectly tailored suit, his expression unchanged as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger with the mechanical precision of someone performing a business function. "Do you, Zara Williams, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The words felt surreal, like they were happening to someone else. She heard herself say "I do," but the voice sounded distant, disconnected. "Do you, Jin-woo Kang, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" His "I do" was firm, decisive, final. "By the power vested in me by the District of Columbia, I now pronounce you husband and wife." No one suggested they kiss. No rice was thrown. Her parents hugged her goodbye with the desperate urgency of people who knew they might never see each other again. Her father whispered apologies that came too late to matter. Her mother pressed a small gold locket into her hands, the only piece of jewelry she owned. The car waiting outside the courthouse was a black Mercedes with tinted windows and a driver who kept his eyes forward when Jin-woo opened the passenger door for her. "This is your life now," he said quietly as she slid into leather seats that probably cost more than her family's monthly rent. "Learn to make the best of it." As the car pulled away from the curb, Zara watched her parents grow smaller in the rear window until they disappeared entirely. Her new husband sat beside her in silence, already checking messages on his phone, his wedding ring catching the light as he typed. The city she had known all her life passed by outside the windows, but everything looked different now. filtered through the realization that she was no longer Zara Williams, college-bound dreamer. She was Mrs. Kang Jinwoo, wife of a Korean crime boss, and Howard University felt like a dream from someone else's life. The drive to Jinwoo's compound took 45 minutes through increasingly affluent neighborhoods until they reached a gated community in McLean, Virginia that screamed old money and careful privacy. The gates were electronic, the walls were 12 feet high, and the security cameras tracked their approach with mechanical precision. This wasn't just wealth, Zara realized as they passed through multiple checkpoints. This was a fortress disguised as a palace. The main house sprawled across perfectly manicured grounds like something from a magazine about lifestyles she had only imagined. 3 stories of stone and glass, with wings that seemed to extend in every direction, connected by covered walkways and surrounded by gardens that probably required a full-time staff to maintain. The circular driveway was paved in stones that looked imported, and the fountain in the center featured carved dragons that seemed to watch their approach. "Your quarters are in the East Wing," Jinwoo said as they stepped out of the Mercedes. "You have your own bedroom, bathroom, and sitting area. The staff has been informed of your arrival and your status as my wife. They will address you as Mrs. Kang and show appropriate respect." He walked with the measured pace of a man who had never hurried for anyone, his expensive shoes clicking against the stone steps leading to massive front doors that opened before they reached them. The man who greeted them was middle-aged, Korean, and dressed in a crisp black suit that marked him as security rather than household staff. "This is Mr. Park, my head of security," Jinwoo said without breaking stride. "He will coordinate any movement outside the compound. For your safety, you are not to leave without escort and approval." Zara felt the walls closing in before she had even crossed the threshold. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, original oil paintings and furniture that belonged in museums. But every beautiful detail felt like another bar in a very expensive cage. Mrs. Chun appeared as they entered the main foyer, an elegant woman in her 50s wearing a black dress and a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was clearly the head housekeeper, someone who managed this vast household with the efficiency of a military operation. "Mrs. Chun will show you to your quarters and explain the household routine," Jinwoo said, his tone formal and businesslike. "Dinner is served at 7. You are expected to join me." He walked away without waiting for a response, his footsteps echoing in the vast hallway until they faded completely. Mrs. Chun waited until he was out of sight before speaking, her voice kind but cautious. "This way, Mrs. Kang. Your rooms have been prepared." The East Wing was an apartment unto itself, with a bedroom larger than her family's entire living room, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub that could fit 3 people, and a sitting area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. The furniture was elegant but impersonal, like an expensive hotel suite designed to impress rather than comfort. "Your clothing has been ordered and should arrive tomorrow," Mrs. Chun explained, opening an empty walk-in closet that could have housed a small family. "Mr. Kang selected a personal shopper based on your measurements and his preferences for your wardrobe. Breakfast is available from 6 to 9, lunch from 12 to 2. You may request meals in your quarters or take them in the dining room." Zara turned from the window where she had been studying the high walls visible in the distance. "What about college?" "Howard University. I'm supposed to start classes in 6 weeks." Mrs. Chin's expression became carefully neutral. "I believe Mr. Kang intends to discuss your future plans with you personally." The first dinner was an exercise in controlled tension. The dining room could have seated 20 people, but only 2 places were set at one end of a table that stretched like a football field. Jinwoo sat at the head, Zara to his right, separated by enough space that conversation required actual effort. The meal was perfectly prepared Korean cuisine, served by silent staff who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Zara had never eaten Korean food before, but she found herself appreciating the complex flavors despite the circumstances. She ate in silence for the first few courses, watching Jinwoo from the corner of her eye as he consumed his meal with the same mechanical precision he seemed to apply to everything else. "The Howard University scholarship," she said finally, setting down her chopsticks with more force than necessary. "I need to defer enrollment, not forfeit it entirely." Jinwoo looked up from his plate, his dark eyes studying her with the intensity of a man not accustomed to being interrupted during meals. "College is no longer a practical consideration," he said, his tone suggesting the matter was already decided. "Your responsibilities now lie elsewhere." Zara felt something hot and defiant rise in her chest, overriding the fear and overwhelming circumstances. "My responsibilities," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "include using the brain God gave me for more than looking pretty at dinner parties." The silence that followed stretched like a taut wire. Mrs. Chun, who had been supervising the serving staff, seemed to freeze in place. Even the staff members carrying dishes moved more carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever fragile dynamic was playing out at the table. Jinwoo set down his own chopsticks and leaned back in his chair, his sharp features revealing nothing. "You speak very boldly for someone in your position," he said quietly. "My position," Zara replied, meeting his gaze directly, "is that of your wife, not your property." The marriage certificate didn't include a lobotomy clause. Something flickered in Jinwoo's eyes that might have been surprise or might have been respect. He studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "Intelligence can be dangerous when paired with defiance, Mrs. Kong." "Then it's fortunate," she said, not backing down despite the warning in his voice, "that I plan to use mine constructively." The remainder of the meal passed in silence. But it was a different quality of silence now, charged with an acknowledgement that their dynamic had shifted. Zara had drawn a line, and Jinwoo was recalculating whatever assumptions he had made about his 18-year-old bride. After dinner, she was allowed a supervised phone call to her parents. Mr. Park stood within earshot as she spoke to her mother, keeping the conversation brief and focusing on reassurances that she was safe and well-treated. She didn't mention the college conversation or the tension at dinner. Some battles were better fought privately. That first night alone in her beautiful prison, Zara sat by the window looking out at grounds lit by security lights and tried to process the reality of her new life. She was married to a man she didn't know, living in luxury she had never imagined, and trapped by circumstances beyond her control. But she was also alive, her family was safe, and she had just proven to herself that she still had a voice. When morning came, she was awake before dawn, already dressed and ready when Mrs. Chun arrived with breakfast. The older woman seemed surprised to find her up and alert rather than hiding under the covers. "I'd like to establish a routine," Zara said as Mrs. Chun set down the breakfast tray. "Exercise time, study time, and a schedule for phone calls to my family. I may be stuck here, but I won't waste away." Mrs. Chun nodded slowly, and Zara thought she detected a hint of approval in the woman's careful expression. "I will discuss this with Mr. Kong," she said. As the door closed behind the housekeeper, Zara looked out at her new world and made herself a promise. She might be trapped, but she would not be broken. Whatever game Kong Jinwoo thought he was playing, he was about to discover that his 18-year-old bride had no intention of becoming a decorative object on his shelf. 3 months into her marriage, Zara had found an uneasy rhythm within the golden cage of Jinwoo's compound. She had negotiated study time for online courses, established a workout routine in the home gym, and even convinced Mrs. Chun to teach her basic Korean phrases during their morning conversations. But she maintained a careful distance from her husband, speaking to him only when necessary and treating their interactions like business meetings between reluctant colleagues. The supervised trip to the Korean market in Annandale was meant to be a small taste of normalcy, a chance for Zara to select ingredients for a cooking lesson she had requested from the chef. Mr. Park accompanied her with 2 additional security personnel, but the outing felt almost normal as she wandered the aisles examining unfamiliar vegetables and reading labels in Korean characters she was slowly learning to recognize. She was comparing prices on different brands of kimchi when she noticed the men. 3 Korean men in dark clothing who had been in the produce section when they arrived, then near the meat counter when she moved there, and now lingering by the front entrance in a way that made the hair on her neck stand up. Her months in Jinwoo's world had taught her to read danger signals, and every instinct was screaming warnings. "Mr. Park," she said quietly, moving closer to the security chief. "Those men by the door." He followed her gaze, and his expression hardened immediately. "Mrs. Kong, please stay close to me," he said, his hand moving inside his jacket as he spoke rapidly into a wireless earpiece in Korean. The attack came swift and coordinated. The three men moved toward them while two more appeared from outside, blocking the exits. Mr. Park pushed Zara behind a display of rice bags as gunfire erupted in the small market, sending other shoppers screaming and diving for cover. "Down! Stay down!" Mr. Park shouted, returning fire with practiced precision. But there were too many of them, and they had planned this carefully. One of Jinwoo's men fell, then another. Mr. Park took a bullet in the shoulder but kept fighting, his face grim with the knowledge that they were outnumbered. Zara crouched behind the rice bags, her heart hammering against her ribs as bullets shattered glass and sent products flying from shelves. She had never been in a gunfight, never imagined the deafening noise and acrid smell of gunpowder that now filled the small space. These men weren't here to rob the market. They were here for her. One of the attackers broke through Mr. Park's defensive line, moving directly toward Zara with purposeful intent. She saw the calculation in his eyes, the way he held his weapon ready but not aimed to kill. They wanted her alive, which meant this wasn't random violence. This was business. "Mrs. Calm," he said in accented English, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. "You come with us now. No more shooting." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, followed by the screech of tires outside. Car doors slammed, and then new gunfire erupted, but this time it was disciplined, professional, coordinated. Jinwoo's reinforcements had arrived. The change in the attackers' demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The confidence drained from their faces as they realized they had miscalculated the response time and the level of force that would be brought to bear. The man who had been approaching Zara suddenly looked desperate, trapped, knowing that his window of opportunity was closing. What followed was swift and brutal. Jinwoo entered the market like a force of nature, his expensive suit replaced by tactical gear, flanked by men who moved with military precision. The remaining attackers surrendered or fell within minutes, and the sudden silence was almost as shocking as the gunfire had been. Jinwoo's dark eyes found Zara immediately, scanning her from head to toe with clinical efficiency before he moved to where she crouched behind the rice bags. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but when he spoke to her, his voice was steady. "Are you injured?" he asked, his hands checking her for wounds despite her visible unharmed state. "No," she whispered, her voice hoarse from fear and adrenaline. "Mr. Park, he's hurt." "Already being handled," Jinwoo said, glancing toward where medics were working on his security chief. "He's alive. Professional hazard." The drive back to the compound passed in silence, but it was heavy with unspoken implications. Zara stared out the window at familiar neighborhoods that now seemed different, more dangerous, knowing that men with guns could be waiting anywhere. The world she thought she understood had revealed another layer of complexity. That evening, Jinwoo summoned her to his private office, a room she had never entered before. It was masculine and imposing, with dark wood paneling and bookshelves filled with volumes in Korean, English, and Japanese. The massive desk was clear except for a single file folder and two glasses of what looked like expensive whiskey. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "We need to discuss what happened today." Zara settled into the leather chair, her back straight despite her exhaustion. She had spent the afternoon processing the attack, trying to understand why anyone would want to kidnap her specifically. The whiskey sat untouched as Jinwoo opened the file and spread out photographs and documents. "The men who attacked you today work for the Hwang organization," he said, his finger tapping a photograph of one of the attackers. "They've been trying to weaken my position for months. Your father's debt was the opening they needed." "I don't understand," Zara said, leaning forward to study the papers. "What does my father's gambling have to do with gang wars?" "Everything," Jinwoo replied, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "Your father didn't just owe money for gambling. He was feeding information about my operations to the Hwangs in exchange for extensions on his payments. They knew about my businesses, my schedule, my security protocols. When I married you, I cut off their intelligence source and gained leverage over him simultaneously." The implications hit her like physical blows. Her father hadn't just been a victim of gambling addiction. He had been actively betraying the man who was now her husband, putting everyone in danger. The marriage hadn't just been about settling debt. It had been about neutralizing a security threat. "You married me to stop a spy," she said, the words bitter in her mouth. I married you to protect my family from yours, Jinwoo corrected. But today proved the Huangs still see you as valuable, either as leverage against me or as a source of information if they can turn you like they turned your father. Zara felt sick, understanding finally why the attack had felt so personal, why the men had wanted her alive rather than dead. She wasn't just collateral anymore. She was a strategic asset in a war she had never known existed. My family, she said, thinking of her parents and younger sister back in D.C. Are they safe? For now, Jinwoo said. I have people watching them. But if you were to leave, if our marriage were to end, I couldn't guarantee their protection would continue. The Huangs would see them as easy targets. So I'm trapped, she said, the weight of her situation settling over her like a suffocating blanket. Forever. We're both trapped, Jinwoo said quietly, something shifting in his expression. You think I chose this life? You think I wanted to spend my existence watching for assassins and calculating the loyalty of every person around me? I inherited this empire when I was barely older than you are now, and every day since has been about survival. Before she could respond, his phone rang with an urgent tone that made him answer immediately. He listened for a moment, his face growing dark, then hung up and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. Your sister collapsed at school, he said. She's been taken to George Washington University Hospital. Diabetic emergency. Zara felt the blood drain from her face. Keisha was only 14, a freshman in high school who had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 2 years ago. The family's insurance was minimal, and they had been struggling to afford her medications and monitoring supplies even before the gambling debts consumed everything. I need to go to her, Zara said, standing quickly. Right now? Jinwoo was already moving, reaching for his jacket and keys. The helicopter will be faster than driving, he said. My pilot can have us there in 20 minutes. The flight to D.C. passed in a blur of worry and helicopter noise. Zara stared down at the city lights below, thinking about her little sister lying in a hospital bed, probably scared and alone. When they landed on the hospital roof, Jinwoo's people had already cleared their path to the pediatric ICU. Keisha was unconscious when they arrived, surrounded by machines and 4 lines, looking impossibly small in the hospital bed. Zara's parents sat beside her, their faces drawn with worry and the particular exhaustion that comes from poverty grinding against medical crisis. Her insulin pump failed, her mother explained through tears. We couldn't afford the newer model, and the old one just stopped working. Her blood sugar was over 400 when the paramedics found her. Zara felt Jinwoo move past her to speak with the doctor, his voice low but authoritative. Within minutes, a specialist was being consulted, additional tests were ordered, and the conversations about insurance coverage and payment plans that had been worrying her parents simply disappeared. When Keisha woke up 6 hours later, weak but stable, the first thing she saw was her big sister holding her hand. The second thing she noticed was the tall Korean man standing quietly by the window, somehow managing to look both dangerous and protective simultaneously. Later, as they prepared to return to Virginia, Zara's father pulled her aside. I'm sorry, he said, his voice broken with guilt. For all of it. The debt, the marriage, putting you in danger. I never meant for it to go this far. Zara looked at this man who had shaped her entire life through his weaknesses and poor choices, feeling a complex mixture of anger, love, and exhaustion. I know, Dad, she said finally. We all make choices. Now I have to live with the consequences of yours. On the helicopter ride back, Zara sat in silence processing everything that had happened. The attack, the revelation about her father's betrayal, Keisha's medical emergency, and Jinwoo's immediate response to help her family despite having no obligation to do so. Thank you, she said as the compound came into view below them. For Keisha, for taking care of everything. Jinwoo looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read in the dim cabin lighting. She's your family, he said simply. That makes her my responsibility now. The words hung between them as they landed, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine. Zara was beginning to understand that her husband was not the monster she had imagined, but she wasn't sure yet what that made him instead. 6 months into their marriage, Zara had established a routine that felt almost normal despite the extraordinary circumstances. She had enrolled in online courses through a community college, working toward prerequisites that might eventually transfer to a 4-year program. Her Korean language skills were improving daily through conversations with Mrs. Chun and the household staff, and she had even begun helping with some of the administrative work for Jinwoo's legitimate businesses. But tonight was different. Tonight she was required to play the role she had been avoiding since their wedding day, the perfect wife of a powerful man. The dinner party was being held at the compound, a gathering of Jinwoo's business associates and their wives that served as both social occasion and strategic networking. Mrs. Chun had spent the afternoon helping Zara prepare, selecting a midnight blue silk dress that was elegant without being ostentatious, and coaching her on the social dynamics she would need to navigate. "These men will judge Mr. Kong by your behavior," Mrs. Chun explained as she helped Zara with her jewelry. "In our culture, a man's wife reflects his status and his ability to maintain order in all aspects of his life. You must be gracious, intelligent, but not too outspoken, present but not overshadowing." Zara studied herself in the mirror, barely recognizing the sophisticated woman looking back. The expensive dress fit perfectly, the understated diamond necklace caught the light elegantly, and her natural hair had been styled in an upswept design that showed off the graceful line of her neck. She looked like she belonged in this world of wealth and power, even if she still felt like an imposter. Jinwoo was waiting at the bottom of the main staircase when she descended, and for a moment she saw something flicker in his dark eyes that looked almost like appreciation. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than her family's annual income, his sharp features composed in the expression of controlled authority she had grown accustomed to. "You look appropriate," he said, which she had learned was his version of a compliment. "Remember, you are Mrs. Kong Jinwoo tonight. That name carries weight and expectations." The guests began arriving at 7, and Zara found herself moving through the evening like an actress playing a role she had studied but never rehearsed. She greeted each couple with the proper level of warmth, remembered names and personal details Jinwoo had briefed her on, and managed conversations about art, travel, and cultural events with women who had never worked a day in their lives. Mr. Huang arrived with his wife, and Zara felt the atmosphere shift subtly. This was Li Huang, the legitimate face of the organization that had tried to kidnap her months earlier. The man who smiled and shook hands with Jinwoo while planning his destruction behind closed doors. The tension was invisible to outsiders, but Zara could feel it crackling between the two men like an electrical current. "Mrs. Kong," Li Huang said when Jinwoo introduced them, his smile never reaching his eyes. "What a pleasure to finally meet you. Your husband speaks of you often." "The pleasure is mutual," Zara replied smoothly, maintaining perfect composure despite knowing this man had ordered her kidnapping. "Jinwoo has told me so much about your business relationship." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in polite warfare, each party probing for weaknesses while maintaining the facade of social courtesy. Zara found herself surprisingly adept at the verbal chess match, picking up on subtle cues and responding with exactly the right level of information and deflection. When the dinner moved to the formal dining room, she was seated between the wife of a shipping magnate and a city councilman whose legitimate career provided cover for his less legitimate investments. The conversation flowed from Korean politics to American cultural differences to the challenges of managing international business interests. "Your wife has excellent insights into the education system," the councilman said to Jinwoo during a discussion about community development projects. "Has she worked in that field?" "Zara was studying to become a teacher before our marriage," Jinwoo replied smoothly. "Her perspective on youth development programs has been invaluable in some of our community initiatives." It was the first time he had publicly acknowledged her educational goals, and Zara felt something shift inside her chest. He could have dismissed her background entirely, could have invented some more prestigious history for her. Instead, he had chosen to present her intelligence and ambitions as assets rather than inconveniences. The evening concluded with cigars and whiskey for the men and coffee with dessert for the women. Zara navigated the separate social rituals with growing confidence, discussing fashion and travel with women who had clearly been prepared to dismiss her as a trophy wife, but found themselves impressed by her composure and intelligence. As the last guests departed, Zara felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical weight. She had been performing for hours, maintaining perfect posture and perfect responses while her mind tracked every nuance of conversation for potential threats or opportunities. You did well tonight, Jinwoo said as they watched the final car disappear down the driveway. Better than I expected. Coming from him, it felt like high praise. She had proven she could function in his world, could be an asset rather than a liability. But the performance had also shown her how isolated this life was, how every interaction was calculated and every word weighed for strategic value. I need air, she said, walking toward the garden doors. The formal dining room suddenly felt suffocating. The garden at night was peaceful, lit by subtle landscape lighting that created pools of warmth without destroying the natural shadows. Zara walked the stone paths she had memorized during her months of captivity, breathing in the cool night air and trying to process the evening's performance. Jinwoo found her sitting on a bench near the fountain, her expensive shoes kicked off and her bare feet tucked under her dress. He had loosened his tie and removed his suit jacket, looking more relaxed than she had ever seen him. You surprised them tonight, he said, settling beside her on the bench with careful distance between them. They expected a young American wife who would smile and say nothing. Instead, they found someone who could hold her own in conversations about municipal policy and cultural integration. I surprised myself, Zara admitted. 6 months ago, I would have been terrified to speak to those people. Now it felt like just another performance in this strange life I'm living. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the sound of the fountain providing a gentle backdrop to their thoughts. It was the most peaceful moment they had shared since their wedding day, free from the constant tension and careful boundaries that usually defined their interactions. Can I ask you something? Zara said finally, turning to study his profile in the dim lighting. Did you ever want something different? Before all this, before you became who you are now. Jinwoo was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it, stripped of the controlled authority that usually defined his speech. I wanted to be a teacher, he said, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they surprised her. History, specifically Korean history. I had this idea that I could help young Korean Americans understand their heritage, bridge the gap between traditional culture and modern American life. Zara stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with the man she thought she knew. What changed your mind? My father was murdered when I was 22, he said simply, shot down in the street by rivals who wanted to take over his territory. My mother lasted 6 months before grief killed her just as surely as a bullet would have. I inherited an empire I never wanted and enemies I couldn't escape. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable. Zara found herself seeing him differently, not as the cold crime boss who had bought her like property, but as someone who had been trapped by circumstances just as surely as she had been. You never had a choice, she said, understanding flooding through her. Just like me. Choice is a luxury most people take for granted, Jinwoo replied, his dark eyes meeting hers in the garden lighting. Every decision I make is constrained by responsibilities I inherited, enemies I didn't create, and loyalties that were forged in blood before I was old enough to understand what they meant. Zara thought about her own dreams, her scholarship to Howard University, the teaching career she had planned that seemed impossibly distant now. She had been angry for months about her stolen choices, but she had never considered that her captor might be just as trapped as she was. I wanted to teach too, she said quietly. Elementary school, probably. I thought I could make a difference for kids who were growing up like I did. Show them that education could be a way out of poverty and limited options. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Two people who had dreamed of shaping young minds, now bound together in a life that made such dreams impossible. Maybe that's why, Jinwoo said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. Why you adapted so quickly, why you don't break under pressure. Teachers have to be strong. They have to protect the vulnerable while managing impossible circumstances with limited resources. She looked at him more carefully, seeing past the expensive clothes and dangerous reputation to the young man who had wanted to teach history. Maybe that's why you're so good at this, she said. Managing people, creating loyalty, building something larger than yourself. Those are teaching skills too. The observation seemed to surprise him. He turned to face her more directly, and she realized they had somehow moved closer together on the bench during their conversation. The careful distance he always maintained had disappeared without either of them noticing. Do you think we could have been friends, he asked, if we had met under different circumstances? If I had been a teacher and you had been a teacher, working at schools across town from each other. Zara considered this seriously, studying his face in the gentle lighting. Stripped of the power dynamics and forced circumstances, what kind of person was Kang Jinwoo? I think so, she said finally. I think we might have understood each other. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the bench between them. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact since their wedding day, and she felt him go very still under her touch. I'm sorry, she said, and she meant it. For what happened to your parents, for the life you never got to choose, for the fact that teaching history became impossible because you had to make history instead. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the controlled facade he maintained so carefully. I'm sorry too, he said quietly. For your father's choices, for the debt that brought you here, for the dreams you had to sacrifice because of decisions that were never yours to make. They sat in the garden holding hands like two people who had finally found something they recognized in each other. Not love, not yet, but understanding. A recognition that they were both casualties of circumstances larger than themselves, both trapped in roles they had never auditioned for. I can't give you back your old life, Jinwoo said eventually. But maybe we can build something here that feels less like punishment and more like partnership. Zara squeezed his hand gently, feeling something inside her chest that had been frozen for months beginning to thaw. Maybe we can, she agreed. Maybe we're both stronger than we thought we were. The night air grew cooler, but neither of them moved to go inside. For the first time since their wedding, they had found common ground that felt genuine rather than strategic. They were still trapped, still bound by forces beyond their control, but they no longer had to face that reality alone. When they finally returned to the house, something fundamental had changed between them. They were no longer captor and prisoner, or even husband and wife by force. They were two intelligent people who had decided to stop fighting their circumstances and start working together to make the best of an impossible situation. It wasn't love yet, but it was the foundation that love might someday be built upon. And for two people who had learned to expect very little from life, that felt like more than they had dared to hope for. The federal agents arrived on a Tuesday morning while Jinwoo was in Seattle for a legitimate business meeting about shipping contracts. Zara was in the library studying for her online economics course when Mrs. Chen knocked on the door with an expression that immediately put her on alert. FBI agents are here to see you, Mrs. Chen said quietly. They have a warrant. Zara closed her textbook and straightened her shoulders, drawing on the composure she had learned to maintain during the past 8 months. She had known this day might come, had seen enough crime movies to understand that wives of suspected criminals eventually faced this choice. Agent Sarah Martinez was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as she took in the opulent surroundings of Jinwoo's home office. Her partner, Agent James Wilson, was younger but carried himself with the same professional authority that suggested they had done this many times before. Mrs. Kong, Agent Martinez said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from Jinwoo's massive desk. We'd like to discuss your husband's business activities and your knowledge of his operations. I'm not sure I can help you, Zara replied carefully. I don't involve myself in my husband's work. Agent Wilson opened a thick file folder and spread photographs across the desk. Images of Jinwoo meeting with known criminals, surveillance photos of money transfers, documents with Korean text, and numbers that clearly represented financial transactions. We've been building a case against your husband for 2 years, Agent Martinez said. Racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit violent crimes. We have enough evidence to guarantee a conviction that will put him away for life. Zara stared at the photographs, recognizing some of the faces from the dinner party months earlier. Men who had smiled and made polite conversation while their wives discussed charity events and vacation plans. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, and probably accurate. However, Agent Wilson continued, we're prepared to offer you complete immunity and witness protection in exchange for your cooperation. You're young, Mrs. Kong. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let loyalty to a criminal destroy your future. The offer hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Freedom from the compound, from the constant security, from the moral compromises that had become her daily reality. A chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her 8 months ago. What exactly are you asking me to do? Zara said finally. Testify about conversations you've overheard, meetings you've witnessed, any knowledge you have about his financial operations or criminal associates, Agent Martinez explained. In exchange, you'll receive a new identity, relocation to anywhere in the country, and federal protection for you and your family. Zara thought about her parents in D.C., about Keisha, whose medical care was now completely covered by Jinwoo's insurance, about the online courses she was taking that might never lead to the teaching career she had dreamed of. The agents were offering her everything she thought she wanted, everything she had lost when she walked down that courthouse aisle. "I need time to think about this," she said. Agent Wilson leaned forward, his voice taking on an urgent tone. "Mrs. Kong, we have reason to believe your husband's organization is planning something significant in the next few weeks. If you wait too long, people could get hurt, including you." They left their business cards and a secure phone number, promising to return in 48 hours for her answer. After they departed, Zara sat alone in Jinwoo's office holding their offer and trying to understand why her first instinct had been to refuse rather than accept immediately. The attack came 36 hours later, while Jinwoo was still in Seattle and the compound's security was operating on reduced protocols. Zara was in the kitchen learning to make traditional Korean soup from the chef when the first explosions shook the building. The lights went out immediately, followed by the sharp wail of emergency alarms and the distinctive sound of automatic weapons fire. Mrs. Chun appeared beside Zara with a flashlight and a pistol that she handled with surprising competence. "Basement safe room," Mrs. Chun said urgently. "Now." But as they moved toward the emergency protocols Jinwoo had drilled into everyone, Zara realized something that stopped her in her tracks. The safe room was exactly where attackers would expect the family to hide. It was a trap designed to contain rather than protect. "Wait," she said, grabbing Mrs. Chen's arm. "The safe room is the first place they'll check. We need to get to Jinwoo's office instead." Mrs. Chen looked confused, but years of working for Jinwoo had taught her to trust quick thinking under pressure. They moved through darkened hallways toward the office, avoiding the main corridors where they could hear boots and shouted commands in Korean. The office had a hidden panic room behind the bookshelf that only family members knew about, along with a communication system that connected directly to Jinwoo's security teams. As they huddled in the small space, Zara could hear the attackers moving through the house, searching systematically for evidence, money, and people. Through the surveillance monitors in the panic room, she watched armed men rifle through Jinwoo's files, looking for financial records and contact information. But they were missing the real treasure, the encrypted hard drives and backup systems hidden behind false walls that contained the evidence that could destroy dozens of criminal organizations. "We have to destroy the servers," Zara whispered to Mrs. Chun. "If they find those files, everyone connected to Jinwoo's organization will be killed or imprisoned." Mrs. Chun stared at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. "That's very dangerous, Mrs. Kong. The self-destruct system requires someone to stay and manually activate it." Zara thought about Agent Martinez's offer, about the new life waiting for her if she simply let these men take what they came for. But she also thought about the household staff who had become her friends, about the legitimate businesses that employed hundreds of people, about Jinwoo returning to find his world destroyed because she had chosen safety over loyalty. "Tell me how to do it," she said. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of careful movement and calculated risks. While Mrs. Chun coordinated with the remaining security personnel through encrypted communications, Zara made her way to the server room in the basement, avoiding the attackers who were still searching the upper floors. The manual activation required entering a complex code sequence while standing within 15 feet of the servers, which meant she would have less than 60 seconds to reach safety before the electromagnetic pulse destroyed everything electronic in the building. As she entered the final digits, she heard footsteps on the stairs above her. The pulse hit like a physical wave, knocking out all lights and communications throughout the compound. In the sudden darkness, Zara ran toward the emergency exit, feeling her way along walls she had memorized during months of exploring her prison. Behind her, she could hear confused shouting as the attackers realized they had lost everything they came for. She almost made it to safety before the piece of falling ceiling caught her across the temple, sending her to the ground with blood streaming down her face. The last thing she remembered was the sound of helicopters approaching and someone shouting her name. She woke up in the compound's medical facility with Jinwoo sitting beside her bed. his face a mask of controlled fury and barely contained emotion. His expensive suit was wrinkled and dirty, his hair disheveled, and his dark eyes held an expression she had never seen before. "The doctor says you have a mild concussion," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "Mrs. Chun told me what you did. About the servers, about refusing to hide in the safe room, about protecting the organization." Zara tried to sit up and immediately regretted it as the room spun around her. "I couldn't let them win," she said simply. "Too many people would have been hurt." Jinwoo stared at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with her physical injuries. "You saved everything," he said quietly. "The businesses, the people, the financial networks that keep hundreds of families fed. You saved my world when you could have let it burn." "The federal agents came to see me," Zara said, meeting his gaze directly. "They offered me immunity, witness protection, a new life. Everything I thought I wanted." Something flickered in Jinwoo's eyes that might have been fear or might have been pain. "And what did you tell them?" "I told them I needed time to think," she said. "But when the attack started, when I saw those men trying to destroy what you've built, I realized something. This is my world now too. These people, this life, it's not what I chose, but it's what I've become part of. And I couldn't betray it." Jinwoo reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses and scars that marked his fingers. "You could have walked away," he said, his voice thick with emotion she had never heard from him before. "You could have been free." "Freedom isn't just about having choices," Zara replied, understanding something about herself that surprised her. "It's about making choices you can live with. I couldn't live with myself if I destroyed the lives of everyone who depends on you." The silence stretched between them, charged with unspoken truths and emotions neither of them had been prepared to face. When Jinwoo finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "You're mine," he said, not a declaration of ownership but a recognition of something deeper. "Not by force, not by debt, not by circumstance. You're mine by choice, and that terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced." Zara felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked into his dark eyes and saw not the cold crime boss, but the man who had wanted to teach history, who carried the weight of an empire he never chose, who had just realized that losing her would have destroyed him more completely than any business rival ever could. "And you're mine," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was admitting. "Broken parts and all. Not because I have to be here, but because I choose to be here. Because somehow, impossibly, this has become home." When he kissed her, it wasn't the careful, formal kiss of their wedding ceremony, but something desperate and real and years in the making. She tasted the fear he had carried rushing back to find her injured, the relief that she was alive, the wonder that she had chosen him over freedom when given the chance. They held each other in the medical facility as dawn broke over the compound, two people who had finally stopped running from the feelings that had been growing between them. The marriage certificate had made them husband and wife, but the choice to protect each other had made them something deeper. Outside, security teams were assessing damage and coordinating with law enforcement about the attack. Inside, Jinwoo and Zara were discovering that love could grow even in the most unlikely circumstances, between two people who had been trapped by fate but chose each other freely. When the federal agents returned the next day for Zara's answer, they found a young woman who had made her choice with full knowledge of its consequences. She would not be testifying against her husband. She would not be accepting their protection. She was exactly where she belonged, with the man she had chosen to stand beside regardless of the cost. The agents left disappointed but not entirely surprised. They had seen this before, the way loyalty could grow between people who started as strangers and ended as something closer than blood. As their car disappeared down the driveway, Zara stood beside Jinwoo watching them go, her hand firmly clasped in his. They were no longer captor and captive, no longer forced partners navigating an impossible situation. They were husband and wife by choice now, bound together by something stronger than contracts or debts or family obligations. They had found love in the last place they had expected to look, and they were ready to build a future together that belonged to them alone. The elimination of the Huang organization took 3 weeks and was conducted with the surgical precision that had made Kang Jinwoo one of the most respected and feared men in the Korean American criminal community. But unlike the violent territorial wars of the past, This campaign was fought primarily through legal channels, federal cooperation, and strategic financial pressure that left their enemies destroyed without bloodshed. Zara watched from Jinhua's office as FBI agents arrested Li Huang and 6 of his top lieutenants on charges that had been building for months before the attack on their compound. Agent Martinez had been surprisingly receptive to information about the Huang organization's activities, especially when it came from a source who had proven her loyalty by refusing witness protection. "Your testimony about their criminal operations was extremely helpful," Agent Martinez said during her final visit to the compound. "Even though you declined our protection offer, your cooperation in bringing down the people who tried to kill you has been invaluable." Zara had found an unexpected ally in the federal agent, a woman who understood the complex loyalties that bound families together even under the most difficult circumstances. The information she provided about the attack and the evidence recovered from the failed raid had given the FBI everything they needed to dismantle the organization that had threatened her family's safety. The formal business transformation began 6 months later. Jinwu had been planning the transition to legitimate enterprises for years, but Zara's near death during the compound attack had crystallized his determination to build something sustainable rather than dangerous. The shipping company expanded into international logistics, the real estate investments grew into a development corporation, and the financial networks became a private banking institution serving Korean-American businesses. "I want to build something our children won't have to be ashamed of," he told her as they reviewed architectural plans for the new corporate headquarters. "Something that creates jobs instead of destroying lives, that builds communities instead of tearing them apart." The day Marcus Williams's debt was officially forgiven was marked not by ceremony, but by a simple phone call. Zara spoke to her father from the same office where she had first learned the true scope of his betrayal. But the conversation carried none of the anger and resentment that had once defined their relationship. "The money you owed is gone," she told him, her voice calm and final. "The debt is cleared, the interest is forgiven, and you're free from all obligations. But Dad, if you ever gamble again, if you ever put yourself or your family at risk again, I won't be able to protect you." Her father's tears were audible through the phone as he promised reform and expressed gratitude he would never be able to adequately voice. Zara accepted his apologies with the grace of someone who had learned to understand the difference between forgiveness and forgetting. The real wedding ceremony took place on a warm spring morning exactly 18 months after their courthouse marriage. This time, Zara wore a dress she had chosen herself, a flowing gown of ivory silk that made her feel beautiful rather than purchased. The ceremony was held in the garden where they had first talked honestly about their dreams and disappointments, with only family and close friends as witnesses. "Do you, Zara Williams Kong, take this man to be your husband, to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for richer and poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" This time when she said "I do," the words carried the weight of choice rather than coercion. She was marrying him not because of debt or force or circumstance, but because they had built something together that felt stronger than the circumstances that had brought them together. "Do you, Jinwoo Kong, take this woman to be your wife, to love and cherish, in sickness and health, for richer and poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" His "I do" was spoken with an emotion that the courthouse ceremony had never contained, the voice of a man who had found something he never expected and was claiming it freely. When they kissed this time, it was witnessed by her family who had flown in from D.C., by Mrs. Chun who had become a second mother to Zara, by the household staff who had watched their relationship transform from mutual hostility to genuine partnership. Even Agent Martinez attended, having become an unexpected friend through the process of dismantling their enemies. Zara graduated from community college with highest honors on a Tuesday in May, 2 years after she should have been finishing her freshman year at Howard University. Jinwoo sat in the audience wearing a simple gray suit instead of his usual expensive formal wear, applauding with the pride of a man whose wife had achieved something through her own intelligence and determination rather than his connections. The acceptance letter to the education program at George Washington University arrived 3 weeks later, along with a full scholarship funded by an anonymous donor who happened to be married to one of the most successful businessmen in the Korean-American community. Zara would begin her bachelor's degree in elementary education that fall, finally pursuing the teaching career she had dreamed of since childhood. The pregnancy revelation came as a surprise during what was supposed to be a routine medical checkup following a minor kitchen accident. Dr. Sarah Kim, the family physician, smiled as she delivered news that would change their lives in ways neither of them had anticipated. "Congratulations, Mrs. Kong. You're about 8 weeks pregnant. Everything looks healthy and normal." Zara stared at the ultrasound image showing a tiny blob that would become their child, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of bringing new life into their complex world. When she showed the picture to Jinwoo that evening, she watched his controlled expression dissolve into something she had never seen before. "Our baby," he said, his voice full of wonder as he touched the ultrasound image with careful fingers. "Someone who will never know what it feels like to be trapped by other people's choices." They designed the new house together, a sprawling but comfortable home in the Virginia countryside that prioritized family space over ostentatious display. The security was state-of-the-art but invisible. The grounds were spacious enough for children to play safely, and the home office was designed to accommodate both his business needs and her future teaching materials. The foundation was established during Zara's second trimester, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing educational support for disadvantaged children in the D.C. area. The Kong Foundation for Educational Excellence offered tutoring, scholarship programs, and mentorship opportunities for students whose families struggled with poverty and limited resources. Standing in the Foundation's first tutoring center, watching volunteer teachers work with children who reminded her of her younger self, Zara felt the circle of her life completing in ways she had never imagined. She was using Jinwoo's resources and her educational expertise to create opportunities for children who needed someone to believe in their potential. "This is what I was meant to do," she told Jinwoo as they watched a teenage girl receive news of her college scholarship. "Not the traditional classroom I imagined, but something bigger, something that can change entire families." Jinwoo stood behind her with his hands resting on her growing belly, watching his wife transform the wealth he had accumulated through questionable means into something that would benefit generations of children. She had taken his dark empire and found ways to make it shine light into the world. Their daughter was born on a snowy February morning, a perfect combination of her parents' features with Zara's warm brown eyes and Jinwoo's elegant bone structure. They named her Grace, for the unexpected blessing she represented and the grace that had allowed her parents to find love despite impossible circumstances. Holding their newborn daughter in the hospital room, Zara thought about the 18-year-old girl who had walked into a courthouse in a department store dress, terrified and resentful, and convinced her life was over. That girl could never have imagined the woman she had become, the love she had found, the family she had created through choice rather than obligation. 2 years later, as she stood in her foundation's newest location watching Grace take her first wobbly steps while Jinwoo conducted a board meeting for his legitimate business empire, Zara reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. She had been forced to marry a dangerous stranger to pay her father's debts. She had discovered that the stranger was as trapped by circumstances as she was. They had built trust through shared danger, understanding through revealed vulnerability, and love through the daily choice to support each other despite having every reason to remain enemies. The compound where she had been a prisoner was now a corporate retreat center. The fortune built through criminal enterprises had become a legitimate business empire that provided jobs for hundreds of families. The forced marriage had become a genuine partnership based on mutual respect, shared goals, and authentic love. Grace babbled happily as she explored the tutoring center, completely unaware that her father had once been one of the most feared men in the Korean-American criminal community, or that her mother had once been traded like property to settle a gambling debt. She would grow up knowing only that her parents loved each other and had built something beautiful together. As evening approached and they prepared to return to their home in the countryside, Zara caught her reflection in the center's windows. She saw a confident woman wearing comfortable clothes and practical shoes, her natural hair styled in a way that was professional but authentic, her wedding ring catching the light as she gestured while talking to a young teacher. She looked nothing like the terrified teenager who had signed marriage papers in a courthouse, and everything like the teacher she had always dreamed of becoming. The path had been nothing like what she had planned, but the destination was more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined. That night, as they put Grace to bed in the nursery they had designed together, Jinwoo pulled Zara close and spoke the words that had become their evening ritual. "No regrets," he said quietly, the same question and statement he made every night. "No regrets," she confirmed, meaning it completely. Not about the debt, not about the forced marriage, not about the dangerous world that had brought them together. Their love had grown from the most unlikely soil, but it had grown strong and true and lasting. Outside their home, security teams maintained their watch and business associates conducted legitimate commerce, and federal agents considered the Kong organization a model of successful transition from criminal enterprise to respected corporation. Inside, a family slept peacefully, their future secured not through violence or coercion, but through love, partnership, and the daily choice to build something better together than either of them could have created alone. Zara Williams had walked into a courthouse as a scared girl, trading her freedom for her family's safety. She had emerged as Mrs. Kong Jinwoo and discovered that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most impossible circumstances.